Kandinsky, a Russian, a gentleman, an artist, but more than anything else, a genius. Be careful if you get closer to him. He has enchanted millions of people, and if he catches you, he won't let you go either. Munich, Leinbach House. Kandinsky is waiting for you. But what can he do for you personally? The most important thing might be to open your innermost eye. But not until that happens will you truly be able to say, I have really seen Kandinsky. Twilight in New York. He's out there, somewhere out there in this ocean of lights, and he wants to show you something. So come along and follow. Excuse me, could you let us by, please? We have a rendezvous with Kandinsky. Here we are. An American billionaire once met Kandinsky in Germany and bought many of his paintings. Later on, he built a museum for all the treasures he collected throughout his life. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. And that is where you are right now. You'll see them in a minute. The Kandinskys. They're just a few steps further. Are you ready? Really ready for Kandinsky? Ready in your heart of hearts? The other visitors are already immersing themselves, devout, silent, contemplating the paintings. So why don't you move a bit closer to get a better impression? They aren't really pretty paintings at all, are they? Actually, they're rather confusing, almost artificial. And you wouldn't be the first person who didn't like Kandinsky. But wait a moment. Give the Russian artist a chance. Wait and see what he wants to say to you. It might awaken something thrilling, deep within you.
Ja, da ist immer die starke Wirkung der Farbe.
The colors always have a very strong effect, an effect that the viewer can trace quite easily by looking at how the artist worked with his canvas, with the brush, using different methods for different colors, placing them in relationship to one another, introducing a rhythm into his painterly style. I think this is one of the aspects that makes his work so fascinating.
Einer der Aspekte, die sein Werk so faszinierend machen.
But Kandinsky isn't only showing you parts of his world. He also wants to take in something from yours.
Also auf jeden Fall offen und unvoreingenommen.
Kandinsky certainly wanted the viewers of his pictures to be open and unprejudiced, without any prior knowledge. and it made no difference whether the viewer was educated or naive. He hated critics, people who looked at his pictures with preconceived notions in mind. He wanted freedom, a very direct approach, and he wanted the viewers to be receptive to the spiritual vibrations that his works emit.
So how about coming along on our journey? How about getting to know Kandinsky a little better, and even getting to know yourself a little better too? We begin our Kandinsky journey in the artist's birthplace. Moscow on a warm spring day. The golden towers of the basilicas sparkle in the sunlight. And in the evening, everything is full of magic and enchantment. The Kremlin, the nerve center of Russia. But first, let's turn back the hands of time. Vasily Kandinsky was born on December 4th, 1866, into the family of a wealthy merchant. However, Vasily's parents would later divorce, and he was eventually raised by his aunt. During that time, he discovered something that deeply moved his soul: his love for Mother Russia. Have you ever been to Russia? You haven't? Then come along and have a look. Can you see that enchanted world? Cottages that seem to have been taken from the pages of a fabulous storybook. A real world, but one that reflects Russia's love for myths, legends, and fairy tales. And something else has shaped the Russian soul: its love for colors that are bright, brilliant, and dazzling. That's probably one of the reasons why Russian folk artists often prefer to paint on a black undercoat, just like on this souvenir. A delicately painted fairy tale, where each colored figure shimmers like miniature fireworks in the nighttime sky. And all of a sudden, you feel close to this Russian, to Vasily Kandinsky, who not only gave us this painting, but also the expressiveness of color. Moscow is lit up magnificently this evening too. As a student, Kandinsky probably strolled across this square. But something entirely different was stirring in his blood. His heart was moved by art rather than his studies in economics and law. A visit to a Moscow exhibition became a life-changing experience. The Haystack by Claude Monet. There's a lot to see, but no haystack. Or is there? Kandinsky later wrote, "I only found out it was a haystack from the catalogue. It was unrecognizable as such. It was embarrassing that I couldn't tell what it was. I also thought the artist had no right to paint so indistinctly. And I noted with astonishment and confusion that the picture was not only gripping, but also irrevocably imprinted on my memory." Following this experience, Kandinsky abandoned his successful legal career and rekindled his artistic life. Kandinsky left Moscow in 1896 and moved to Munich, where he began studying art at the Academy. Scientific and technical discoveries stoked a feverish spirit of optimism at the turn of the century. The arts, too, were drawn into this maelstrom and finally shook the foundations of the venerable academies. Modernity battled against tradition, and no one knew which was going to win. From this point on, Kandinsky and the other modernist artists were called the Young Wild Ones. They no longer copied nature, but rather poured their entire souls out onto the canvas. They were taunted and ridiculed as exotic eccentrics, and Kandinsky also felt the effects of this emotional upheaval. His critics dismissed him as good for nothing, and a gallery owner once complained of having to dry off his paintings daily because of the many visitors who had spit on them. Kandinsky's time hadn't arrived yet. He was still too modern for his contemporaries. So Kandinsky kept a lookout for others who shared his views, and found the Phalanx Group, a loose circle of art students. One of his protégés was Gabriele, with whom he was soon living together, though the couple was unmarried. That too caused a scandal because Kandinsky had already been married to another woman. The time for new ideas had come, but nevertheless, you can still clearly recognize the world of material objects. Take, for instance, this early groundbreaking painting titled A Color for Life.
In Kandinskys großformatigen Bild, Das bunte Leben,
in Kandinsky's large painting, A Color for Life, you can see a great number of old Russian characters who seem to all come from the Middle Ages. A large crowd of people, young and old, from all layers of society, a couple embracing, a woman with a child, a beggar, a priest, a knight with a sword, and many more, a whole panorama of human life, but all presented very mysteriously on a black background. The dots and patches of color that define the figures are disassociative, like a mosaic. And behind them, there's the curve of a river, and above and beyond it, a hill with a Kremlin town on top, the typical colorful Russian Kremlin with its spires that Kandinsky often used in his later paintings too, but in a more abstract, encoded way.
Hold on a second. Right now, everything's still quiet here. But Kandinsky's artistic power is about to burst forth like a ferocious storm that is going to sweep all objects out of art in just the blink of an eye. Kandinsky and Münter looked for a quiet and inspirational place in the country and found it at the foot of the Alps, surrounded by wilderness and luxuriant scenery. Murnau. Now things gained momentum. The objects finally began to lose their place within reality. All of a sudden, the painted main street of Murnau appears as a torrential purple river. The church tower in Murnau. It does seem a bit crooked, but that's exactly the point. The world's traditions are out of place. Kandinsky no longer asks, "Is the tower straight?" He asks, "Do you feel the storm raging within you?" Soon afterwards, Gabriele bought a house in Murnau at Kottmüller Allee number 6. When the villagers noticed Kandinsky and his, for the most part, Russian compatriots coming and going during the summers, they began calling it the Russian House. And this will be the place where Kandinsky deprives objects of their external form as well. Yet Kandinsky was a really likable fellow. He wore traditional Bavarian clothes, worked in the garden, and enjoyed cycling. At first glance, you would have called him a nice guy. Nevertheless, deep in his heart of hearts, he was a warrior with sharp claws. Then there was the experience of Murnau, where Münter and Kandinsky spent the summer of 1909 painting together with Werefkin and Jawlensky. There was a sudden explosion of color. The viewer can see how the objects represented became less and less important. how color becomes the dominant force, and how a new musicality is introduced that no longer consists of painting and copying real objects, but is rather based on the experience of color, as the artists themselves described it. Now, the path Kandinsky took was constantly rising to the next level of fine arts, formulating a new world of forms and colors. The few like-minded people who surrounded him evoked this new basic principle of art. On the outside, mere paperwork. Yet, on the inside, a hurricane named der blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider. Now, Kandinsky and his fellow artist Franz Marc loudly proclaim, a form is no longer a thing, but rather something that vibrates deep within you, your deepest hopes and fears, triggered by the power of colors. And these are the Blue Riders, first with Marc, then with Kandinsky, the two pioneers of modern spirit in arts. And what about you? Did you also catch sight of something he is gazing at? Kandinsky rushes ahead and is nearly impossible to catch, just like his beloved knight St. George battling the dragon. Or the recurrent motif of the rower who faces the back current of a river. Another lonely fighter. Colors and forms have been liberated from one another. As you can imagine, the world had never seen anything like this before. And that's why both critics and the public were hostile towards Kandinsky. They still hadn't understood his ideas. But there were a few patrons who believed in him and decided to support him. And soon, almost everyone knew of this Russian artist. He often sat in the rustically furnished dining area of the Münter house, writing down his innermost thoughts in sentences like these. The artwork is composed of two elements, the inner and the outer. The inner is the emotion in the soul of the artist. This emotion has the capacity to evoke similar emotions in the observer. And what do his artworks reveal now? The crooked church tower of Murnau can no longer be seen. All external forms have been discarded, and only an inner feeling radiates from the canvas. The objects have vanished. Abstraction has arrived. But don't be afraid. What are you thinking of when you see something like this? Maybe this. Or even this. Many people will also be thinking along the same lines. But that's exactly what Kandinsky rejected. He doesn't want you to think of preserved images. He wants you to listen to your heart of hearts. Blue, it feels like something transcendental. Do you feel it? The same is true of forms. What do you think of when you read this word? You probably have another image stored in your head, an object that you've seen thousands of times. But Kandinsky's rider is not an object. It's a force, a feeling that compels you to take the world by storm, as though you were the only one who could save it, the only hope that's left. That's why Kandinsky decided to sketch his rider with just a few lines and colors, so that you're not distracted from your mission. Abstraction leaves something out, and gives your inner eye the chance to attain true freedom. And what about the rower? He's slowly dissolving too, fighting against the current in a sea of color, and then only existing as a few lines. On the outside. On the inside, he's still struggling against the opposing forces. The Kremlin, Kandinsky's home, and Kandinsky's deepest yearning. It changes on the outside, but never on the inside. What does that mean? The canvas suddenly shows something coming from the artist's innermost soul, and it finds its way into your innermost soul.
This example shows very clearly how color and form now pull in two directions. The lines are now mere black contours that vaguely define the figures and shapes, while the colors float freely within the space of the picture. This picture, of course, has a very significant but highly encoded content. The figures are emerging from an arched gateway. They then go through the blue, as it were. Blue is the color of the spirit, and are then elongated. And then in the violet on the other side, they experience something like an epiphany or an enlightenment. With paintings like these, Kandinsky really was trying to express the spiritual in art, vibrations of the soul. These are completely new motifs that Kandinsky introduced into 20th century painting.
Kandinsky's name, his works and thoughts spread and became increasingly popular. Objects had finally discarded their outer layer to reveal their determining power deep within, their heartstrings. But suddenly, everything came to a halt again with the beginning of World War I. The Blue Riders August Macke and Franz Marc fell on the battlefield. Kandinsky, the foreigner, was forced to flee Germany. The beginning of a long odyssey. Kandinsky went to Switzerland, Russia, Sweden, then returned again to Russia. 1915, in Stockholm, he meets Gabriele again, but this was to be the final farewell. Back in Moscow, Kandinsky married once more, the general's daughter, Nina. Both of them lived in this Moscow tenement owned by the artist. This city is the ground from which I draw my energy and where I can live the inner life that my work demands. Following the 1917 October Revolution, Kandinsky became a cultural administrator for the new government, but he soon fell from favor and was forced to leave Russia. This would be the last time he saw his beloved home country. He returned to Germany in 1921. First, he moved to Berlin, then Weimar, and finally to Dessau, where an entirely different Kandinsky was about to appear. Dessau, in eastern Germany, south of Berlin. An old bakery. It's been closed for many decades and is soon to be renovated. We discover it by chance. It immediately takes us back to the 1920s. This is how it might have looked when he moved to Dessau. And who knows, maybe Vasily Kandinsky used to buy his bread here. About 100 yards away stands a building that looks as though it had been designed by contemporary architects. In fact, this sophisticated design dates from the 1920s. The Bauhaus, a new school that liberated architecture and artisanry from the constraints of tradition. Clean lines, modern forms, and clear colors. Even today, the visionary Bauhaus ideas are still influential throughout the world. Two of the great Bauhaus teachers lived next door to each other in this master's house, Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky. House number 6 belonged to the Kandinskys. The Russians' art was now lived, taught, and painted in Dessau. Are you curious? Just follow us and enter into their private, intimate world. He lived right here. And next door to the bedroom, we'll find his studio, where he did his creative work. And what's he doing now? The canvases become more radical than ever. Geometry and severity, the hustling and bustling of triangles, lines and circles. But don't worry, take your time and have a look. That's right. Sometimes these works remind one of wild musical notation, with the shapes beating the time. But that is no coincidence. Color and form are indeed performing a concert here, set off by Kandinsky's rare gift of hearing colors and seeing sounds. This sensual phenomenon is called synesthesia. When Kandinsky saw the color yellow, for instance, he automatically heard the sound of a trumpet. Light blue, he wrote, sounded like a flute. Dark blue, like a cello. And even deeper blue was like an organ. The sounds of colors, which he preserved on canvas. His instruments, palette and paintbrush. Once, Kandinsky said, "Color is the claviature. The eyes are the hammer. The soul is the piano, with its many strings. The artist is the hand that by touching this or that key sets the soul vibrating." I think that you can speak of musical color tones in Kandinsky's art, musical colors that each viewer will hear and understand differently, and also that Kandinsky, working with musical colors, and particularly with the various primary colors, employed a strong sense of rhythm, especially in his use of black. He works with both sounds and musical rhythm, like the rowing rhythm that uses several strong strokes, which you can see driving into the bottom left of this painting here, like whiplashes. Germany, 1933. Times are changing. A cold and dark period in world history has begun. The din of a dictator drowned out the inner sound. And once more, Wassily Kandinsky was swept away by history. The bells of Notre Dame resound through the streets of Paris, heralding the last chapter in Kandinsky's life, in the city of love and arts. And what about him? Yes, he's going to surprise you once more. Wassily and Nina Kandinsky live on the 6th floor of this house in Paris-Neuilly. Today, the only reminder of the building's famous inhabitant is a plaque on the wall next to the front door. But rare photographs give us an impression of Kandinsky's private room, with works of that Russian artist now worth millions decorating the walls. When I moved to Paris, I was so shaken by the local light and natural surroundings that I did not want to see any new pictures and could not paint for nearly 2 months. I first had to digest my impressions. Then, the wonderful light of Paris freed up my palate. And in a moment, you will feel the magic of Parisian light too. Let's move on to a place that vibrates day and night. The Centre Pompidou, a museum to modernism that makes no effort to present a pretty facade. It seems to want to turn itself inside out. That's also quite abstract, isn't it? A transparent escalator takes us up above the roofs of Paris until we're at eye level with the treasures contained within. His late works really do look different. A kind of organic mass intended perhaps to symbolize the entire universe. It's enough to drive you crazy. So what on earth happened to Kandinsky in Paris? There are more Kandinskys like these in the depot of the Centre Pompidou. And perhaps now we finally understand what it means to see through his eyes.
Perhaps these were also memories, distant memories of his home and of his Russian years. Even the Russian Far East that we see in the colors, the artificial colors that suddenly appeared, turquoise, violet, gold, orange and silver, and others which had not been part of his earlier palette. There was also a new organic, amorphous approach, which combined with the geometrical elements to create a completely new pictorial world. Kandinsky was perhaps trying to achieve a new synthesis with a universal symbolism. Perhaps he really was successful and managed to create a new universal style. If you remember his Paris works that can now be seen as reproductions in hotel rooms everywhere, as posters and designs on textiles that are reminiscent of Kandinsky, his formal repertoire is obviously very attractive.
Finally, his easel remained empty. On December 13th, 1944, Wassily Kandinsky's colorful life came to an end.
War ein Mensch, der vermutlich auch
He was probably a little impulsive and straightforward, and he could react that way as well, as far as we know from some parts of his diaries and letters. I suppose he was a vivid character, a fragile man, as pictures and his old frock coat still show today. Even though he was not very tall, he was a rather self-possessed person. So how do you feel now, at the end of the journey? It's true, he robbed you of the world of objects, but he gives you something in return as well. The strength of the night and the energy of the rower. Possibly one of the best deals you've ever gotten, don't you think? But actually, he should tell you himself.